high priesthood in Jerusalem, thereby making all his descendants priests from the sect of the Jerusalem priesthood. It seems that along with the grandson of Eliashib, the priest, other Yahudian priests came to Mount Gerizim, where they built and sanctified the temple as a replica of the Jerusalem temple. The power of the Gerizim temple in the 2nd century BCE was no less strong than that of Jerusalem. It was sanctified by the Samaritans in Samaria and in the diaspora, particularly in Egypt, and led to an intense conflict between the Yahudim and the Samaritans, as mentioned. It began first as a theological argument about Mount Gerizim and Mount Moriah and the holy places, in the end of the 2nd century BCE led to a bitter war between the Hasmoneans and the Samaritans. It was the high priest Yochanan Hyrcanus that besieged Mount Gerizim and completely destroyed the city. You know, Pastor George, you have anything to add to that?
Oh.
I figured you would.
Yeah. Shechem. Well, Shechem was a very holy city to the northern house of Israel because of its close associations with Joseph, Isaac, and Jacob, although, of course, not with Abraham, who was associated with Judea. And scholars believe that there was an intense debate when David became king, argument that they wanted to establish the capital for the 12 tribes at Shechem rather than Jerusalem. And if you ever wondered why we have these square Hebrew letters today, it's because in the 3rd century, when the Samaritans adopted the Torah, the Judean priests did not want to use the same Torah as the Samaritans because they hated them so much. Wow. So they threw out the historic ancient Hebrew text, the Israelite text, and substituted the square Hebrew letters that are now used. However, interestingly enough, they continue to always write the sacred name using the original ancient Israelite characters, which is, I notice, that you also use when you anoint people, rather than the square modern Hebrew. But the reason we have those square Hebrew letters today was due to the hatred. They weren't going to use the same Torah and the same alphabet as the Samaritans were, and so they made a sweeping sea change, changed the whole alphabet. And that was the whole interesting story behind it, but that's the true story.
Yeah, so, you know, knowing this, you know, you can kind of see the demographics of Samaria, you know, the people and the feud betwixt the Yahudim and the Samaritans. You know, it was real thick. You know, these were like arch enemies by the time Messiah walked the earth, you know. So this was like a real strange thing, you know, her coming, Messiah asking her to draw water for him, you know. So this wasn't nothing that would have been taken lightly, you know. That's why she was so taken back and she responds the way that she does to the things that he says, you know. So it really helps to know that history to formulate a proper picture of what was transpiring here. Okay. Next. Okay. Yochanan 4:21. Yahushua saith unto her, Woman, believe me, since you recognize that I am a prophet. He's letting her know. Since you recognize that I'm a prophet, then believe me this. The hour cometh when ye shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father. See, now it's important to note that at this particular time when he was speaking to her, they were at Mount Gerizim, you know, right at his foot, that the temple was already destroyed in Mount Gerizim by the former high priest Yochanan Hyrcanus. But the Samaritans continued to offer sacrifice there, for they still deemed the place sacred and it to be the rightful place of worship to Elohim. So they were still worshiping there. You know, the altar was still there, even though, you know, the temple had been torn down. You know, and this is why she was saying, you know, our fathers worshiped in this mountain, but you all say that you worship over in Jerusalem. You know, which one is which, since you're a prophet? You know, and Yah is responding, you know, yeah, since you perceive that I am a prophet, And let me tell you this, the hour cometh when ye shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father. Now, take note, he's speaking, he's actually speaking prophecy. And he's prophesying the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, even as the temple that was in Mount Gerizim was destroyed. Notice he says, the hour cometh. It's not yet there. It's coming. You know, when ye shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem. You know, so he was actually speaking about the destruction of the temple even then. Yochanan 4:22. Ye worship ye know not what. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Yahudim. So to answer her question, he's letting her know. Yeah, y'all worshiping Elohim, but y'all don't know what he is. Y'all don't understand. This is that same word Edo, which means to see or to know. Ye worship what ye not what. Ye worship ye know not what. You don't know what you worship. You don't understand what you're worshiping. We understand what we worship. For the salvation is of the Yahudim. You know, the Yahudim, you know, they had not only Torah, but all the writings as well as the prophets. You know, so they did know. You know, salvation is of the Yahudim. Genesis 35:4. And they gave unto Jacob all the strange Elohim or gods which were in their hand, and all their earnings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the oak, which was by Shechem. This is that same land, the same place that so long ago that after who was it? The sons of Israel had, after they raped Dinah, and the sons of Israel went over there and they slew all the people of the city Shechem. And then, you know, Yaakov was going to worship Yah to see what he should do. He had them strip themselves of all the strange Elohim that were in their hand and all the earrings that was in their ears, and he hid them under the oak, which was by Shechem. You know, could this have been revelatory to what would take place in this region? You know, because years later, that place has always been, you know, a place where they worship idols in conjunction with Elohim. You know, it's as if those hidden gods are still hidden in the land. They're still in the Israelites that are in the land. You know, they're still within us, you know, if you would. You know, the Israelites of this region worship some of everything, you know, and as a result have become likened to Yahweh's well, that is spiritually dead, disconnected from its spiritual source, you know, and that's why they got ejected from the land, you know, and even though they brought other peoples in the land and taught them, you know, they still didn't give up their Elohim because they didn't understand who they were serving, you know, and this is what Yahushua is speaking to. Ye worship ye know not what. They didn't understand who they was worshiping. They didn't understand that Elohim was the Elohim of all. You know, they thought he was like a corporal type El. They thought that, you know, he just was like a person, you know, like can be embodied in it, that he was just like, you know, likened unto the other Elohim that they were serving. You know, well, he was the Elohim of this land, but I'm going to serve the Elohim of the sun, and I'm going to serve the El of the moon, and then, you know, I want some babies, so I'm going to serve Ishtar. I want some money, so I'm going to serve Ishtar. So, you know, they were serving all these different Elohim, you know, in the land. See, they didn't understand that that once you serve Yahuwah Elohim, that he was the Almighty, the all-encompassing, that he was omnipresent, that he couldn't be contained, that within him was everything contained. You know, see, they didn't understand that. See, but on the other hand, the Yahudim did understand that. So, because we see Solomon, when he dedicated the temple, he said, you know, what is this building? You know, you way bigger than this. You know, we know, I know you can't fit in here. You know, but you know, we just, you know, this when you see us praying here, you know, have mercy on us. You know, even when we go out the way and we come back and we pray, we know the whole earth is your footstool. So what is this little building I done made you? You know, they understood Elohim in that manner. And they understood that everything was in him, you know, and that he wasn't like an El that was in the world. You know, but the Israelites, they didn't quite see that, and that's why, you know, they worshipped all their idols and things along with them. But they got disconnected from the source, and that's why they didn't know. You know, they stopped going over to where Yah placed his name. You know, and they wanted, they made their own place to place Yah's name. See, but it don't work like that. You know, see, and that's the whole thing with them. That's why they got evicted from the land to begin with. You know, you can't worship Yah your way. You know, you can't follow him your way. You have to follow him his way.
Yes.
Yochanan 23 and 24. My next reader, please.
But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshippers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship him. Elohim is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth.
Okay. First thing I want you guys to notice is in verse 23. But the hour cometh and now is. Remember last time he said, you know, the hour cometh?
Yes.
He ain't say nothing about now is. Because he was speaking about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which wouldn't happen until after his passion. You know, but this he's talking about was even then. But the hour cometh and now is.
Yes.
When true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship him. Elohim is a spirit, and they that worship must worship him in spirit and in truth. What is exactly this worship? You see, and this is really the crux of this lesson today. I want to make sure that everyone understands what it means to worship their Elohim. By and large, there are essentially 3 words in your Bibles translated as worship. Now, there's about three or four others that's translated as worship, you know, but they're speculative, you know. But these 3 speaks to worship, and by and large, these are the main 3 that's translated as worship throughout the scriptures. You know, like 9 out of 10 times, it's going to be one of these 3. The first one is the Hebrew word, shakah. Number 78:12, it means to bow down in homage to royalty or Elohim. The Aramaic is sagid. Number 54:57, meaning to prostrate oneself, do homage. In the Greek, it's called proskuneo. Number 43:52, meaning to kiss, like a dog licking his master's hand. To crouch, to prostrate oneself like a dog. To literally or figuratively prostrate oneself in homage. Now, as you can see, the common factor that all 3 of these definitions have is prostration and homage. What does it mean to pay homage to someone? Well, according to Webster's 1828 dictionary, in feudal law, or that is ancient law, homage was the submission, loyalty, and service which was promised to a lord or master. The ceremony of doing homage was thus performed. Being ungirt and uncovered, one kneeled and held up both his hands between those of his lord, who sat before him, and there professed that he did become his man from that day forth, of life, limb, and earthly honor, and then received a kiss from his Lord, if he was accepted. Homage means to pay respect. To pay respect to by external action. Y'all got that? Y'all follow me?
Yes.
To pay respect to by external action to give reverence. What does it mean to give reverence? Reverence is a gesture indicative of deep respect. A gesture, again, that's something that you do outwardly. To profess fealty. Fealty is loyalty, sworn loyalty. We see a scriptural example of this ceremony of worship or homage, with Absalom paying homage or worshiping his king and as well his father and king, even King David. Now my next reader reads 2 Samuel 14:32 through 2 Samuel 15:6.
And Absalom answered Joab, Behold, I send unto thee, saying, Come hither, that I may send thee to the king, to say, Wherefore am I come from Jeshurun? It had been good for me to have been there still. Now therefore let me see the king's face, and if there be any iniquity in me, let him kill me. So Joab came to the king and told him, and when he had called for Absalom, he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king. And the king kissed Absalom. And it came to pass after this, that Absalom prepared him chariots and horses, and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom rose up early, and stood beside the way of the gate, and it was so, that when any man that had a controversy came to the king for judgment, then Absalom called unto him, and said, Of what city art thou? And he said, Thy servant is of one of the tribes of Israel. And Absalom said unto him, See, thy matters are good and right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear thee. Absalom said, Moreover, O that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice. And it was so that when any man came nigh to him to do him obeyance, thank you, he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. And on this manner did Absalom do all Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of men of Israel.
Okay, now let's take a closer look at this. First of all, let's see what comes out of Absalom's own mouth in verse 32. And I want you to know that 2 Samuel 14:33 is the last verse of that chapter. So what begins in 15:1 is the very next thing the scriptures present to us in connection with this story. So it says, Now therefore let me see the king's face, and if there be any iniquity in me, let him kill me. Okay, now, when he's coming to see the king's face, he's not just coming to say, hey, Dad. You know, just as a backdrop to this story that you may not know, Absalom had just killed his brother, Amnon. You know, well, not just, but he had killed his brother, Amnon, a couple of years prior and ran away. He ran away to his grandfather's kingdom of Geshurun. Okay? Now, not that he didn't have justification for killing his brother Amnon, because his brother Amnon raped his sister Tamar. I know, sounds like a soap opera. But, you know, he raped his brother, his sister Tamar, and he took vengeance for Tamar. Okay? Now, after doing so, he fled the nation and went over to Geshurun, which was coincidentally was his grandfather's kingdom. Okay, so he was longing to come back. Joab ended up bringing him back, and here it is. He was back for a couple of years, but King David didn't want to see him, you know, because he was still hurt because he slew one of his sons, you know.